Hello and welcome to another Excel VBA tutorial. This is our continuation of our pivot table series. So this is video number 3. Video number 2 and 1, we basically saw how to create a pivot table in VBA, put fields in certain positions. And then in our second video, we talked about calculated fields and items, and then maybe do some formatting stuff, things along that nature. And so now we're moving on to our third video, and in this one we're going to be talking about pivot fields, so individual field items within our pivot table. So we can think of, if you look right over here, this little pane right here, the pivot table fields. If we wanted to, we can manipulate each one of these individual fields and set the properties and methods about them. So pretty cool. That's going to be the first section of our video, and then we're going to move on to a pivot axes and line objects. So your pivot table has two axes. It's got a row axis, and then it's got a column axis, and then within inside of each axis there are lines, and then within each line there are cells. So we're going to see how we can manipulate these objects, at least from what I can kind of tell, to get more information back than anything. I'm not going to say I have a ton of use cases for them yet, but I do kind of want to introduce the topic of saying, hey, if you wanted to access this information, here's how you would go about it. So with that being said, we're going to jump into our VBA tab and we'll get started. Okay, so I'm in my VBA tab. I'm going to clear out my stuff for my little practice session. Okay, and then from here we'll create a new subroutine. We'll call it pivot table part 3. And then from here we're going to declare some variables just like most of our videos. The first one is going to be called pivot table. This will house our pivot table object, so the actual pivot table itself. Then we're going to declare the pivot fields collection. So this is a collection of all the fields that we reference. So you can actually specify certain fields, or you can specify the entire fields of the table. Now we're just going to be focusing on little sections if we wanted to. And then we're going to talk about how we manipulate an individual field. So we're going to declare our final variable. It's very similar. It's a pivot field object. So just like that. So after that, we can now move into the next section, which is referencing our pivot table. So we need to reference the pivot table, our existing one at least. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set the pivot table object equal to the active sheet. We're going to go into the pivot tables collection that belongs to that sheet, and then we're going to pass through the name of our pivot table, which mine is my new pivot table. Now that we've done that, we can reference the fields that we want to. So what we're going to do is we're going to reference a collection of fields. We're going to see that there's different types of collections out there, and then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each individual field to kind of get a feel of what kind of information is available to us. And so the first one, we're going to create a for loop. So we're going to loop through each field in our collection. And so we're going to do a basic for each loop, and we're going to say for each pivot field in pivot tables, and then this is where we have to specify our fields. So there's a couple different sections. I'm going to go back to my pivot table because I think it's just easier to kind of visualize it. So when you select inside of it, this little pane comes up. If you don't see it when you go inside, you just go to, where is it? Your pivot table tools, and then we can basically select this and this will pop it up. So the 4 main sections is the filter fields, also called page fields, the column fields, the row fields, the value fields, which are data fields, and then we have kind of a higher level category. If we wanted to reference the ones that we don't have in our pivot table currently, they are called hidden fields. So hidden fields are up here in the fields list, but they're not down here, so they're not in our pivot table. If we wanted to access all the fields that are currently being used, these are the visible fields. So the visible fields are down here, but they're not up here. And then there's one last group of fields called cube fields. Those are related to Power Pivot, so I'm not going to go into it in this video, but they are something we can access as well. And so we can think of a field as an attribute or a metric that we can move around, play with, and slice and dice. So with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to go into our pivot table object and we're going to reference one of those sections of fields. So the first one that we're going to reference is called the column fields. So this one. And then what we're going to do is put our next statement. And then from here, let's just put some basic information. So we'll print it out in the little immediate window down here. So we'll do debug print pivot field, and then we'll put the name of the field. Let's see what else we can do. And the value. Wonder what else we can do. I'm looking at the next one. I don't have this in my notes, but I'm kind of curious to see what else we have. Base item. Caption, calculation, child field. There's a lot of stuff here. I guess I could do data type. We'll check. I don't know if it will work, but we'll try it. Okay, so if we run this, it should print it all out. Oh, it did. Very cool. So it looks like it returned some value. At least that's what it looked like. Month name and then a data type. So this must be some kind of, you know what it probably is if I'm thinking about it? It's probably, if I looked online, that's probably the VBA code for the data type. So I'll take a look at that one. That's kind of interesting. I didn't realize you could do that. But it looks like it does return at least a code that says the data type of that particular field. So that might come in handy if you're doing calculations or something like that, if it does happen. So yeah, there's column fields. Let's do the row fields. Yeah, that's the one, row fields. Again, country year. We'll do the data fields. Let's see what that one does. Okay, sum of average selling price. Yeah, see, they're a little bit different too, if you notice. So this one's 4145, 4158. We done data fields. Let's do the hidden fields. So these are the ones that are currently not used in our pivot table. A lot of good stuff. We can do the visible fields. We can reference that. Okay, so those are the visible ones. And then the page fields. So that is product. That's the one that's in our filter section. Keep in mind there is one called cube fields, but we don't have any cube fields in our example. Okay, so that's working with a pivot field collection. What we're going to now do is we're going to take an individual pivot field and just see how we can kind of manipulate it a little bit. So I'm going to comment this out because I don't want it to run again. And then from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a reference to a particular pivot field. So create a reference to a single pivot field. We're going to set pivot field equal to the pivot table. We're going to go into the pivot fields collection. I don't know why it's a method. I think this is something where it goes out and gets that field for you, but whatever. I would just probably put it as a collection, but who knows? Or it might just be because you're getting in an individual one. That's probably why. Okay, so now that we have a reference to a pivot field, in this case it's year, what we can do is we can restrict where we place this field on our pivot table. So for example, say I don't want people to be able to put the year value in the column field, or I don't want them to put it hidden. They have to have it included in our pivot table. Well, lucky for us, this is where we can kind of come in and restrict that movement. And so what we can do is in our VBA code, we can take the pivot field that we referenced and we can call the drag, what happened? Oh yeah, I need to shrink this a little bit. I already know, like looking at it, I'm like, wait a minute, IntelliSense isn't working. I must have declared it wrong. So we'll set the drag to column property equal to true. So you can put it, oh no, we'll put it false. I don't want it there. So we'll say, hey, you can't put it in the column field. And we'll put drag to data. You can put it in the data field if you want. And then we'll put the pivot field drag to hide. You know what, say like, yeah, you know what, you have to you have to make sure it's in the pivot table. And then from here, if we set this, let's see what we get. So nothing happens on our end. There's no kind of feedback saying, hey, you've changed it. But now if you go in here, you can't put it there. Kind of neat, right? If I try to put it outside, can't do that either. But I can put it in the product section, and I can put it in my data value. And from here, I am kind of curious because I did see it. I'm not sure if it's going to work for me. Where is it? Drill. Drill down equals false. So I think if I say drill down, it will automatically, I'll do it in the next example. I'm not going to try to figure it out in this one, but I'll take a look and see what we can do more with it. This is kind of just, doing an individual one. Okay, so that's taking an individual field, restricting it so that way, we stop it from being moved around. So that might come in handy for some users where it's like, hey, I've built this pivot table, don't start going around and messing with it. What we're going to do next is we're going to go into the show detail property of a particular cell. And so what we're going to do, and this is just more on my end, but I'm going to have a cell selected, right? What we can always do with a range of cells, for example, is so I go to active cell and I go to the show detail property and I set this equal to true. Basically what will happen is it's like you're double clicking into a cell and it will create a new sheet for you with all the details related to that particular metric. And so we're going to do this through VBA. It's very simple, as you can tell, but if I run this, a new sheet has been created. And then if I go there, it has all the data for that metric. So for example, what I'm trying to calculate here is the sum of COGS for France 2014 in February. So if I look at it, 2014, February, France, COGS. So 1214280. 1214280. Great, it ties just like we were expecting. So that's a nice way if you want to be able to let the user, get some information or details about your particular data set. That's a nice way to do it because sometimes you might have the data set hidden or whatever it might be. You can use the show detail property in order to fix that. So this one is get the detail for the cell. Now what you could also do if you wanted to is you could take my previous video where we showed pivot select. You could do a pivot select the cell that you want, and then set that as your active cell, and then just do that. There's other ways to do it. In fact, there's multiple ways to do it, but this is kind of just saying, hey, you have an active cell. There's different ways to select that cell. Once you have it, this is how you show the detail to it. Okay, so that does it for the pivot fields. We're going to move on to the next section, pivot axes, lines, and line. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to declare more variables. First one is going to be called the pivot axes, and this one will be a pivot axis. Remember, the axes, pivot table has two axes. One axis is your row axis. Next axis is your column axis. Your row axis, I believe, starts from here, so 7 down. So once we have that, and then your axes have something called a lines collection. So that is a pivot lines collection. And then if I want an individual line from that collection, it's a individual pivot line object. And then inside your line object, you have individual cells. But we'll get to that later. Okay, so from here, what we're going to do is we're going to reference an axis of the pivot table. And so we're going to set the pivot axes equal to the pivot table. And then you got a couple. So you got pivot row axes. And if you go up a little bit, there's column axes. I'll work with the row axes. And then I want the pivot lines collection from that axis. So I'm going to set the pivot lines object variable equal to the pivot axes object, and then I'm going to go into the pivot lines collection. Don't even ask how long this took me because the documentation on this Not very good. And this was not clear to me when I first looked at this. So I'm like, huh. So I have to go into the pivot table object to get the axes. And then once I have the axes, then I can go get the line collection. Not intuitive when I first looked at it, because I kept getting mixed up and I said, well, why can't I just declare a pivot line? Like, isn't there a way to do this? Nope, you have to apparently go into the axes, then into the lines collection. If somebody knows different on this one, please share it, because I would love to know this. Okay, so now that I have a collection of lines, I'm going to loop through each line. So loop through each line. And I'm going to say for each pivot line, so each individual line, in pivot lines, oh, sorry, forgot each. In pivot lines, next, and again, we'll just print some information. So we will do debug.print, pivot line, position, debug.print, pivot line, and we will do line type. I think I'll do one more. You got to be careful sometimes when you loop through lines, because not all lines are the same, and so if you try to call certain properties on certain lines, you will get errors. So I'm going to try this one. I'm not going to guarantee it works. Well, line type, creator, parent. I think if I just do application, it's going to come back with Excel, so I don't think it's going to tell us anything meaningful, but we'll do it. What happened? Oh, my apologies. I should have commented that out. Okay. So as we can tell, it went through. The first one is position, the second one is line type, and then the third one is the application, which is just the high-level application. Now, I do have a little note for ourselves, in case you're wondering, you're saying, like, what do all these numerical values mean? Well, lucky for us, I got some notes. So 3 is a pivot, so it's a line that's blank. 2 is grand total. 0 is a regular line, and then 1 is a subtotal. So it looks like line 2 is a subtotal. So this one. So that's what I'm saying. It starts here. This is your subtotal. And if I go to the bottom, that should be 2. Yeah, so that's your grand total. And then I don't think there is a 3 here, because I don't think we technically have, yeah, there's no 3. So that's how, if we wanted to loop through each individual line. Now that we've done that, what we're going to do is we're going to basically loop through each cell in each line. And so I'm going to comment this out. And again, I'm going to have to be really careful when I'm working with, unfortunately, individual lines, because sometimes it can throw off, because one type of line might be very different than the other line, so you can only call certain properties. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to declare another variable. So declare variable, and we're going to call it a pivot cell object. And then this one, as you guessed, is a pivot cell. So an individual pivot cell object. And then from here, we're going to set our pivot line. So an individual line. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into our pivot lines collection. And then from here, we're going to go into the item property. And with the item property, if we pass through the index, it returns the line. So I want line 3, which, if I remember correctly, is this one. So this is line 3. And then the individual cells for this one, from what I can tell, it's these two. It's not this. It's misleading a little bit. But if I get the individual line of my row axes, this is my line. So I should be able to get information back about that line. So this one is reference an individual line. Yeah, it's been fun to do this one because there's not a lot of documentation on this, and unfortunately finding examples online, not easy. In fact, I wasn't able to find actually maybe 1 or 2, if I remember correctly. It's not straightforward. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't dive into this. But if anything, now you guys will know something that a lot of people don't. How to work with pivot lines and cells and all that stuff. Kind of cool, right? Okay, so we're going to loop through each pivot cell in our line. And we're going to say for each pivot cell in, where is it? The pivot line. And then we get two options. You see down here there's cells and then cells full. Cells full include hidden ones. Pivot line cells do not include hidden ones. So from what I think that means is if I had one of these hidden, they would not be included. But if I had the full one, even if it was hidden, it would still be included, at least from what I can tell. I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to explore that one a little bit, and if I find something that's kind of meaningful, I'll share it in the next next video. But we'll just do the full one. We'll just include everybody at this point. And then from here, what we'll do, we'll just print some information about it. So we'll debug print pivot cell dot range, and then we'll go into the debug dot print pivot cell. Where is it? I want the pivot table. So the pivot table that this particular cell belongs to. Debug print pivot cell. I want the pivot cell type, and I got a couple other ones because I tested this before, and you got to be careful which ones you put in here, unfortunately. Field. Okay, so I was able to put field and item. We'll put those ones in then. That was the problem, is when you go between individual lines, like I said, you can't necessarily put the same property for each line, because not all cells not all cells like lines are the same, so you can't access necessarily every single property. So I'm going to try this and see what we get. Okay, perfect, it worked. Okay, so the first one is the range, the pivot table, the cell type, the item, and then the field. So this is item 1 or cell 1. This is cell 2. So that's kind of going back here. When we're talking about a row or a line on the row axes, and we're talking about the cells within that row axes, this is our row axes. This is our line, and these are your two individual cells. And then this is us just getting information about those cells. Naturally, people kind of ask, like, again, we're getting enumeration back to us, the pivot cell type. So what I did is I copied it. And if you want, for your reference, 9 is a blank cell, 7 is a custom subtotal, 4 is data field, 8 is pivot field, data pivot field, I guess. 3 is grand total, 6 is a page field item, 5 is a pivot field, 1 is a pivot item, 2 is a subtotal, and then 0 is a cell value. So this one came back as 1, so this one is a pivot cell item, just like the first one is. So those are the different pivot cell types that you can potentially have. Okay, so I think we have one more. We'll do one more just to kind of demonstrate it, but there technically is like another way we could reference a pivot cell if we want. So one way we could do is if we go into our pivot table object, and then we go into a pivot value cell. From here, we have to pass through a row and then a column. But you got to be careful, because this is kind of where people get a little bit messed up. If I go here, my row starts here. So I'd say row 1, and then my column starts here. So this is column 1, this is row 1. You got to keep that in mind when you're referencing pivot cells. So for example, if I want this cell right here, it's 1, 2, 3 down, and then it's column 1. So what I have to do is if I go back in here, I'd say row 3, column 1 of my pivot table, and then I could go into the pivot cell property of it, and then from here I could always get, if I wanted to, I think it has it here, is it not there? The pivot cell type. And then if I wanted to, I could print that out so we could see it. And then what I'll also do is I'll get the value from it so that way we can see, is it giving us the information back? But I gotta check because I think you can do it one level higher. Yeah, that's what no, I don't want the show detail. I want the value property. Perfect. So I'm gonna clear this out and let's run it. Okay, so it's 0, so it's a value cell, and then it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 6, 9, 1. 1, 2, 3, 1, 6, 9, 1. So it's matching. Column 1, row 3. Threw me off when I first started. I'm like, wait a minute, I got to change how I'm referencing this now. You have to do that with these pivot tables. It kind of throws you off. If I wanted to, now that I have a reference to that cell, I could just simply play around with it even more. So if I wanted the detail for that cell, I would call the show detail method. Remember how up above I said it was a property? It depends. If you're using a pivot value cell, it's a method. If you're using just a typical range object, it's a property. Threw me off when I first did that. Again, not clear. So we'll run it again, and then we'll see it created our sheet for us, just like it did before. So pretty cool. But that does it for today's video. If you have any questions about how to work with pivot cells, pivot lines, pivot axes, please put those comments and questions down in the comments below. I'll keep exploring how we can use this and go into some more detail, but it's kind of hard when you're first doing it because, like I said, there's not a lot of documentation on this, so it's hard to find examples of necessarily where to use it. But I think this is good too because now you guys are seeing just more variety with the pivot table. You're starting to realize there's more than just kind of the 4 or 5 examples you see online. There's actually a lot that we can do with this. Also, if you could make sure to like the video, we always appreciate the support, and we always want to encourage it. And then also, if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So we are going to start moving on to Power Pivot soon. And let me tell you, I got a surprise for you guys on that one. I am building the code in a way that is leveraging the latest of the object model. Here's the problem though. Nobody else, at least from what I can tell, there's like maybe 1 or 2 examples I've been able to find, and they stop at the very beginning, that leverages this new object model. It will make our lives so much easier. So I'm really excited to share this with you guys. I really hope people start using this type of methodology because I think it will make things easier, and I think it will make using Power Pivot in VBA not as quote-unquote scary. So I'm really excited to start doing that one, but it's also a slow learning process because there's like no examples and no documentation. It's very slow, unfortunately. So thanks again for watching, guys. We will see you in the next video.